When we talk about great scientists, rightly we often concentrate on their successes and their triumphs. We cite their most important findings and we celebrate their moments of genius. But by concentrating on the destination, often we overlook the journey. And in this way, many scientists on their path to greatness seem to leave few footprints. For a young student, aiming to follow in the path of such a scientist can seem abstract or even impossible. At the Cubic program here at Florida International University, we seek to unearth those footprints. By exposing our students to as broad a range of careers in science as we can, we aim to show them that there's not one path to success, but many. Welcome to Confluence, where life and science meet. Okay, so we're here today with Dr. Ken Feeley, who's a Professor of Conservation Biology here at FIU. So welcome, Dr. Feeley.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
So I know a bit about your background and that you grew up in Georgia and Atlanta. And so the first question I had was, what was it that made someone from Georgia interested in tropical ecology?
Well, it was nothing in my early youth. I mean, I grew up in Atlanta and had the typical suburban lifestyle. Back then, obviously, there was a lot more empty lots and undeveloped land, so I played around outside and always had kind of a pretty active outdoor lifestyle. But there's nothing tropical about it until I got to university. And as a university student, as a junior, I did a semester abroad. I was in biology. I was already a biology major, but decided to do a semester abroad, and I ended up in Costa Rica. It wasn't even really my top choice, but it was just where I ended up by the end of it. And it was a tropical ecology program, and that was really a life-changing event for me. I think these study abroad programs are kind of by design are life-changing. So I got there, had my first experience outside the US, really fell in love with the tropical rainforest, the diversity, everything about it. And so from then on, I was always kind of in the back of my head. It still wasn't really sure that's what I wanted to do. Came back to school, came back to university, was considering lots of different options still, trying out lots of different things. But then when it finally came time to apply for grad school and thought about what I had enjoyed most in my life, what I'd like to do for the rest of my life, I kept coming back to Costa Rica and my experiences there. And so I actually ended up applying to work with the professor who had written the textbook that we used in Costa Rica, just because it was the only name I knew in the field at that time. And so that headed me down the path. Once I did that, it was basically no turning back, right? I went into grad school, and then the rest is history, and never looked back.
Yeah, so it sounds like your research has kind of taken you all over the world. You've been to some very exciting places. You do a lot of your work in Venezuela and Peru, Costa Rica, you mentioned. What are some of the other exciting places that your work has taken you?
Well, that's one of the great things about this job is you get to travel all over the world. You get to be paid to do it, get all your expenses paid. It's part of your job, right? And so you're looking, you're exploring. Part of biology is exploration. So right now, most of my work is focused in Peru and also in Colombia. I did a lot of work in Venezuela in the past. I've worked in Costa Rica, doing some work in Mexico, but I've also worked in Thailand, Malaysia, China, so kind of all the different corners of the world. Also in Ecuador, working in the Galapagos Islands, a few different places. So a real kind of global tour of different places, and that's just been fantastic for me to see the different places, to be able to compare them, to see what are the similarities and what are the differences. Without that kind of insight, none of this work would really be possible. We'd be way too myopic and focused. So it's really important as students, as researchers, that we get out and we see as much as possible, because without that large-scale vision, you really can't understand what's going on around you.
Yeah, so your work has really taken you kind of all over the world. You get to kind of play the part of the sort of adventurer, really. You mentioned the Galapagos Islands. That sounds fantastic. What were you doing over there?
Well, that was after, when I was an undergrad. As I graduated from an undergrad, I still wasn't exactly sure what I wanted to do. I didn't apply to go to grad school right away. And so I told myself, well, I'm going to go and try a few different jobs as a research assistant. And so I did some work on an island off the coast of Georgia first, and then the next job I took was working in Galapagos Islands for a professor I had as an undergraduate. And it was a fantastic and unique experience. So it ended up being basically me and one other student. They dropped us off on one of the remote Galapagos Islands, and they left us there for 6 months. So it's a real Robinson Crusoe survivor experience. It's actually the first year Survivor came out, and I remember thinking, they don't have anything up on me, because it was me and one other person on an island for 6 months, literally, basically, seeing no other people for months on end.
I imagine that could be hard as well, first of all, having to put up with just one other person for 6 months, but also being kind of away from your family as well for that time.
It was tough. It's one of these things where in all of this work, but being out there, you just fall into a routine of it. It's very tough. The first month you're away and you're missing your family, things are new, then it becomes kind of old hat and routine, and for the next 5 months, and then the last month, you start to get anxious to leave, and it becomes very difficult. But we were there, and very quickly, me and Elaine, the other student I was with, we fell into a routine, and we just kind of stuck to it. It was pretty amazing, because you would think that being out there, you'd be living this wild, free lifestyle, but it was very quickly, we fell into this very formal, rigorous routine that we never really fell out of. By then, it was less novelty and more routine by the end of it. We just kind of did our job and didn't do much else. But it was a fantastic experience, and yeah, it was a unique and definitely transformative experience all the way.
Yeah, so people need their routines. That's something we're kind of telling our students all the time.
Yeah, I think it's a natural part of life, and especially you create your own routine. You find out what works and you stick with it.
So you study the effects of climate change on many species, and one thing that interests me about your research is when we think of climate change, for a lot of people it conjures up images of melting ice caps and polar bears balancing on little cubes of ice. But your work is largely in the tropics. So, and I've read in the past you say that the tropics is actually where some of the most kind of serious effects of climate change are happening. So can you kind of explain a little bit about that?
Yeah, and that's a really important point that you bring up. So when we think of climate change, the vision that comes to mind is the melting glaciers, the melting ice caps, the polar bears, as you said, and those are the real dramatic visual examples we have. And those are important, right? Climate change is, in absolute terms, is happening fastest at the poles, right? That's where the temperature is increasing the fastest. But where most of the vulnerable species are is actually in the tropics, right? So there's just more species in the tropics. That's where most of the Earth's species are. They're in the tropics. And those species are, for many different reasons, they're especially vulnerable to climate change. So they're just really specialized on a narrow range of climates. And so very quickly, even if it's just a small change in temperature, it takes them outside of their comfort zone. A polar bear, it's used to cold winters, hot summers, we're used to all these different changes. So it takes a lot to really shake up that polar bear. You take some sort of tropical, a lemur, a primate, some sort of animal, some sort of plant that's living in the jungle, any little change is really going to disrupt it. And so these species are really, really sensitive. And there's lots of them, and there's lots of people that depend directly on them. And so when we think about where we should be focusing our efforts for protection, the poles are important, but so are the tropics. We can't ignore the tropics. They get ignored a lot of times because there are lots of species, it's complex, we don't know the species, we don't recognize them, and most of the changes aren't very visual. It's green, it's a nice green forest now, it's going to be a nice green forest in 10 years. It's not going from ice cap to no ice, right? So it doesn't make for a very good visual. And that's what the reporters, the media, that's what they're looking for. But the true story, the real story, where we should be looking and should we focus in our efforts, I think is definitely in the tropics, because that's where we're at the greatest risk of losing the most species, and the most species that we depend on as people.
Yeah, so a lot of your research has brought kind of, in some ways, bad news about the effects of climate change, and we see kind of more and more comprehensive research in that area. Given the kind of the scientific consensus behind climate change, why do you think that consensus isn't mirrored in the kind of public perception of climate change, and what can we as scientists do to change that?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of reasons. So, it's always very frustrating as scientists where we see something and we see the data tells us again and again that this is happening, and then there's a complete disconnect with the public, and we run into this stone wall, and there's a lot of reasons for that. I think one big reason behind it is just the time scale that these events are happening. So we're talking about things, 100 years from now, 50 years, say even we're talking 20 years from now. People don't care about what's going to happen 20 years from now. They care about what's going to happen tomorrow, right? And so So it's a disconnect in what we care about and what we should care about, right? And this especially comes true for politics, right? The whole political system is designed around the election cycle. It lasts 4 years, 6 years, however long you're fighting for re-election. And so you're trying to win those votes as a politician. So you have to keep people happy for the next 4 years. Well, it's very difficult then for a politician to say, all right, we're going to have higher taxes. We're going to impose, regulations on your lifestyle so that someone 50 years from now is going to be happy and reap the benefits of that. That just doesn't work for re-election, right? You got to keep people happy now. You don't worry about what's going to happen 50 years from now. And so it's never going to work in politics. The election cycle just doesn't allow for long-term thinking. And so that feeds back in, the politicians are spitting out the message, they're telling the people what to care about, that feeds back into the people, and so it keeps this kind of short-term thinking going on. And people don't want to hear it, right? Because it all comes down to the fact that we do need to make sacrifices now. People don't want to hear that. We do need to have higher taxes, we need to have more regulation, we need to have all these limits placed on our lifestyle so that we can have the benefits in the long term, or we can minimize the dangers in the long term. People don't want to hear that, right? They want to know that we can fix this problem with no cost. And politicians tell us that over and over again. They try to say, we can do this and you won't ever even notice. You won't feel the effect. It just doesn't work, right? We need to accept sacrifice now for the long-term good. People don't want to hear it, and so we're going to keep hitting that wall. Now, the second part of your question is, what can we do as scientists? And it's tough because we're not trained really as spokesmen, right? We have been trained to be the scientists and generate the data. And so I think more and more we're finding ourselves placed in this role of speaking to the media, speaking to the public. And we're not given sufficient training for that. We have been raised and taught how to communicate amongst ourselves through peer-reviewed journals, these things. And it's a different way of communicating. And so we're not good at communicating with the media. And I don't even necessarily feel that, it's all scientists need to be. I think there should be a call out there for a new type, a new career as a translator between the scientists and the public, right? There's people that need to understand science and understand how to translate it into layman's terms, and the terms that people can understand and care about. But we can't expect scientists to do the science and translate it and do everything themselves, right? We need more careers. We need more people that understand it, that can also understand how it impacts daily lives.
Do you think we are seeing a shift in the media towards kind of more scientific coverage and towards more kind of realistic reporting of what scientists are finding?
No, I don't think so really at all. I mean, turn on Fox News and there's a huge disconnect that's still out there. By the power of media and cable and stuff, you have specialized types between the internet and cable and stuff. We have different specialized types of media. So there is scientific media that's out there. You can find science websites. You can find things that are doing a very good job of broadcasting science. And then you can find the exact opposite, right? People are allowed to specialize on what they want to hear about now. So the general media is not doing a better job of conveying science. There are science websites that do a great job of it, but the general, there is no kind of general media anymore. I think that's kind of broken down. So you have, the scientific media, and then you have the deniers media, and there's no common ground between them. There is no, general media that exists anymore.
Yeah. You mentioned kind of deniers, and do you find, as a conservation biologist, especially studying climate change, a lot of the time you're kind of delivering bad news, I suppose. Does that kind of affect the way people receive your work, do you think?
It certainly does. And as I mentioned before, people don't want to hear bad news, right? They don't want to be told that things are looking bad for the future and the only way to fix it is to make the sacrifices. Whenever I present my results, and I know my colleagues feel the same thing, no matter where we present it, everyone's always asking, what's the silver lining, right? People want to have a happy ending. And if we're always being forced to put that happy ending on stuff, then we're watering down our message, right? Sometimes the news is bad, and we need to accept that sometimes we're going to deliver bad news. And there's no way to put a happy ending on it. We shouldn't do false optimism, right? We should be realistic, and if the realistic message is depressing, then so be it, right? We need to fix ways, but that's going to inspire us to fix it, right? If you're overly optimistic and falsely optimistic, you're going to not be motivated to do anything. You're going to be, there's going to be no call to action. So I think by, it's all feeds into it. People don't want to hear bad news, they want to hear the good news, and so we give them the good news, we put it on there, and then as a result, we've watered down our message and we've lost the purpose behind what we're doing. So it's tough. People need to, they need to hear the truth, and we shouldn't shy away from the truth.
Yeah, so I think kind of one thing I wondered kind of related to that is that, in science we often talk about these kind of eureka moments, which may be kind of mythical anyway, but these moments where kind of our work culminates in some realization that changes how we think about something. And for us working in conservation, sometimes those kind of eureka moments are not the most joyous of occasions. But what is it about your work that you do love? What brings you kind of the joy in the work you do?
Well, I mean, it is those, I think some of it is those eureka moments, but they're not life-changing, profound eureka moments. I think as part of being a scientist, one of the great things are the little discoveries, the little victories, right? I think any scientist, to be successful at what they do, they gotta flourish in these little victories, right? So it's having one day's worth of work working out, right? Getting a positive result or any result from your efforts. And so for me, it's going out there, and taking pleasure in solving problems, right? That's all we're doing. We come into this with a big problem in mind that we're trying to solve, and there's lots of little problems along the way. And we're constantly solving those problems, and if you take pleasure in it, then in the end, it's a very rewarding job. But science as a whole has a lot going for it. For lots of people to be scientists, there's a lot of wonderful things about this career, right? We already mentioned that you get to travel, you get to explore, you get to solve problems. They're problems that you come up with, right? You get to define the problem and look for the solution. So it's not even just being imposed on you. There's flexibility in it, there's choice in it. You get to decide what is important, what is not. And it's challenging on all levels, right? There's very few jobs other than being a scientist and a field ecologist and a conservation biologist that challenges every part of you. I can sit for hours on end in my office struggling with writing computer code and doing statistics. And then the next week, I hop on a plane and I go to the jungles of Peru and I'm hacking a trail through the jungle with a machete, right? Where are you combining, where else can you combine these very physical challenges with very mental challenges? Not many other places. And so it's something that requires all of you. It's a true commitment. And I think the people that go into it, they get a lot of reward out of committing themselves to it and seeing the success or the payoff of that commitment at the end as they fight and find the answers to these small little challenges.
Yeah, so it sounds like what you love is kind of the variation in it, in the huge challenge that's involved in it. You've talked a bit about kind of what you love about your job and what you find good about that. What is it about you, do you think, that's made you successful in your field?
Well, there's a lot of different traits, I think, that lead to success for scientists. It's persistence. There are lots of little challenges. There's lots of setbacks and things you have to deal with, struggles of all different types. Biology, science by nature requires large sample sizes, so you have to do something over and over and over and again, right? And so by definition, you have to be persistent. You have to be willing to see, what you conceive, to see it all the way through fruition. I think, being curious, being creative, these are other traits that are incredibly important. You have to want to understand how the world works, and you have to be creative enough to try to figure out how you can figure it out. So there's a lot of different traits. I don't think I have all of them, but by combining pieces of different traits, you can put together a package of there's lots of different ways to create a good scientist. But it's taking pleasure in what you do and enjoying problem solving, I think, is the most important trait, is finding, enjoying that and being creative and curious enough to do it.
Yeah, so just kind of in a final related question, we have kind of a healthy student audience with us today. If you had a piece of advice to give to a student setting out on your field, what would that advice be?
Well, I think the most important thing is to find what you love to do and make your career out of that. You know, I think biology, ecology, all these different things are flexible enough where if you love rock climbing, you can make a career out of studying plants that grow on rock faces. If you love scuba diving, you can make a career out of studying coral reefs. You can find what you love to do and you can make a career out of that. And you gotta remember that it's not gonna be all fun and games, right? The National Geographic moments come, but they're few and far between, right? Most of science is not pretty, right? It is a lot of rote activity. It is a lot of repeat activity. But you know, as long as that's within the context of what you love to do, you can continue to enjoy doing it and you can eventually persevere and be successful at it. So find what you love to do and make a career out of that, right? That's the wonderful thing about biology because you can do that, right? You don't have to fit within a pre-given mold. You can do anything you want. You can do math, physics, chemistry, all within the context of science and all within the context of biology. So find your joy and make that work for you.
Yeah, so that's fantastic advice, I think, and it's always great talking to people who love what they do, and you clearly do. So I'd just like to finish by saying thank you very much, Dr. Feeley.
Well, thank you. I've enjoyed it very much.
My question is, while you were giving the lecture, you were mentioning how a lot of organisms, be it plants, be it in animals, can go through extinction if they can't be able to adapt because of the shortness of time they have. So how would natural selection come into place here? Will not there be a few of them that will be able to survive, will be able to adapt, and they will continue the passing of genes?
Yeah, so the idea is, you know, climate change is no different really from, you know, in general, from any challenge that a species faces, right? And it's these challenges that drive natural selection. So you're exactly right that, you know, there's always going to be some individuals that can persist and survive, right? So there's going to be a lot of extinction, but you might get a few individuals or a few species that are able to persist, and those ones can flourish. So there's going to be winners and losers. What generally seems to happen, though, is we end up with more losers than winners, right? And so you're going to have a few species that benefit from climate change, that persist, that prosper. You're going to have a lot more that go extinct. And so the net loss, you know, the net change is going to be negative. We're going to lose more than we gain, or there's going to be more losers than there are winners. And in this case, that's most likely to be true because of just the pace of this, right? If this was slow, if this was happening gradually through time, then there'd be time for natural selection to work within species. And individual species could evolve. You can have individuals that are winners and losers. Those winners can then go on and reproduce. When climate change is happening very, very fast, like it is, then you can have species that are winners and species that are losers, but you're not going to have, you know, really too much change within a species because there's just not enough time. Evolution requires time. It requires changes between generations. You know, if we're talking about a challenge that's going to hit this tree species within one generation, there's no time for evolution. It just doesn't happen. There's been a few different studies that have tried to look at this potential for evolution, and it's hard to quantify how fast evolution can occur. But one estimate they had was that species are evolving 10,000 times too slow, right, to keep up with climate change. So that's way too slow. They just can't do it. So, you know, there's going to be winners and losers, but we're going to have whole species that are the losers. They're going to be lost. You know, and so that's what we want to avoid. We don't want to lose species. You know, we don't know what that means for the rest of the world and the rest of humanity when we lose those species, right? Some species are going to have huge implications. Other ones we might never notice, but we don't know which ones are going to be important and which ones aren't. And so we got to keep them all around for as long as possible.
Hello.
Hello.
In your presentation, you mentioned how the Amazon rainforest is facing rapid deforestation. How has the Brazilian government reacted to damage to its country's greatest pride?
So the Amazon rainforest, as you mentioned, is facing very rapid rates of deforestation, as are tropical forests around the world. So Brazil is not unique in the rapid rates of deforestation that it faces. It's unique in that it's a very large country. So when we look at absolute terms, rates of deforestation are huge. But there's actually other countries, I should just point out, that are actually facing faster kind of rates of deforestation. Indonesia, some other small countries where they didn't have a whole lot to start with, but they're losing it fast. Brazil, has gone back and forth on its policies as far as fighting deforestation, as have a lot of countries, because they're trying to balance between conservation and economic development, right? So there's always sides that are basically promoting economic development and investment in infrastructure and development of their resources, right? So there will be incentives for people to deforest, incentives for people to develop their land, incentives for people to develop agricultural potential. Then at the same time, they run into then the conservation front. And so they've gone back and forth between times. And so there's been very good periods, and there's been very bad periods. There's just, I'm not up, I couldn't speak definitively of all the current policies of Brazil, but they've been changing their forestry code recently in what's viewed as a negative way. So they're kind of going from what was considered a positive view in conservation to more recently a negative view. But again, it's always this constant struggle. We see it here in the US, we see it in all countries, where people are trying to think about how to develop resources, but then how to do it sustainably. And no one's really found that good balance. Brazil's under a lot of pressure now from outside sources also to develop those resources. China, other countries are investing heavily in Brazil and are pushing for greater development. China, because of increasing population sizes and increasing consumption of animal products, is purchasing and controlling more and more land in countries like Brazil to try and grow soybeans, to bring that soybean to China to feed to their livestock. And that's happening all over. So there's a lot of this land grabbing and international development of resources. So it's not all Brazil alone, but they're facing this pressure from outside sources as well. So it's a very complicated problem. And so there is no, it's very hard for us, even in the US, to sit there and say, well, you don't do this or do that. But we got to hope that eventually they find that balance between development and sustainability and figure out how to develop sustainably.
Do you think that Brazil will continue selling out its land to foreign countries?
I think, it's not going to stop anytime soon. I think all countries are going to do this, right? There's money to be made. There's money to be had. Countries are going to continue to follow the money. And it's hard to tell countries not to do that, and it's even harder to tell individuals not to do that, right? There's many people in Brazil that need the money, that want the money, and they're going to develop the resources that they have available to them. And so we can't tell them not to do that. We need to develop the mindset where they don't want to do that. And so we need to encourage eventually the populace to change their mindset and think about the true economics that go into deforestation. It's not just about the money that you can make today from converting your forest to soybean, but it's the opportunity lost in the future and the services that forest provides that are lost to the future. And so we need people to understand the true economics of their decision. And eventually they'll realize that, earning money now is not always the most profitable in the long run. And then hopefully that will change the mindset and the actions of the individuals and eventually the countries.
So I've heard some people say that climate change has been happening so quickly that it may not be reversible anymore. Do you think we can at least slow it down to a point where evolution can take place and that animals can and other species can, all the species can still survive, or at least most of them can?
So I think that we're never going to stop climate change now, right? It's already happening, it has been happening, and it's going to keep happening. Even if we cut all emissions today, we kind of did all things right today, there's still a big lag built into the system. So CO2 is going to continue increasing in concentration in the atmosphere. Temperatures are going to continue increasing until it kind of works its way out of the system. So we're never going to stop it. We can hope eventually to slow it down and to limit its final trajectory. Whether, in the meantime, there's going to be a lot of change that occurs. So I don't think we're eventually going to say, okay, we're going to slow it down to the pace that evolution can occur. That's really slow. Evolution requires a lot of time. So I think what's going to happen is we're going to try to minimize the changes that will be felt. There's going to be a lot of changes, right? But you still want to minimize it, right? You want to slow that train down as much as possible before it hits the wall. And so that's what we got to do. And so we got to limit it, we got to slow it down, and we got to prepare ourselves for the implications of it. We're going to feel it. right? There's no way around that. The governments, all the agencies, when they talk about climate change, no one talks about stopping it. No one talks about reversing it. We talk about limiting it and slowing it down. We talk nowadays, it's 2 degrees Celsius is kind of what people say we should shoot for. 2 degrees Celsius is a lot, and we're going to feel it. And so, we shouldn't think that we're out of the woods, even if we change our behavior now. We are going to pay for, what we've done in the past and what we continue to do now.
Do you think that if climate change continues the way it's going, that even people might have a hard time dealing with it?
So I don't think, humans, the most wonderful thing about humans is our adaptability, that we're able to, through behavior and culture, we're able to adjust to almost any situation that's thrown at us. So I don't think we're ever going to face risk of, say, extinction, not within, the short term, but we are going to feel it. And we're going to feel climate change, and we're also just going to feel some of the other effects that come into play. So, at the same time that we have climate change happening, we also have the population of the world increasing very rapidly. We're on trajectory to easily hit 9 billion people, maybe 10, maybe 11 billion people are thinking before we stabilize. That's a lot of mouths to feed. There's just not enough land to do it. So even if we get around climate change and don't feel that directly, we're not going to have enough food to feed all those people. We're not going to have enough clean water for all those people. Build on top of that the climate change, and if our agricultural systems start to fail, if they become less productive, if they don't work in the places where they are now, then we're going to have a harder time feeding those 9 billion, 10 billion people. So these things all start to compound on top of each other and make it, a difficult situation. How we respond to that, we don't know. There could be famine, there could be war, there could be problems, or there could just be an ultimate change in our lifestyle. We've done it in the past. We've had the green revolution. We've had different things. Ingenuity sometimes gets us out of a bind. So, but I don't want to count on that, right? You got to prepare for the worst and hope for the best. And with climate change, the worst is pretty bad. So we got to start preparing for that. Don't count on ingenuity to get us out of it, but hope that it does.
You mentioned that many times there was a disconnect between science and the public. And many times, as a scientist, because you study the effects of climate change, and a lot of times that spells bad news for many people, and they don't want to hear it. So I just wanted to ask for your political opinion as a scientist. What are some limitations that some politicians can implement on our lifestyles now? And if possible, how far should those limitations reach?
Well, I think we got to accept greater regulation and greater limitations on our lifestyles, right? So, no one likes to say taxes, but we need to start putting taxes on things. We know that money talks. And so if we want to limit how far people drive, we want to limit what they do, we have to use money essentially as the motivator, in a negative way sometimes, right? So penalties through taxes. So sometimes this cap and trade of carbon is talked about, or I think better is a fee and dividend system where companies or individuals or products are taxed based on how much carbon they use, and then that money is fed back in to reward the people that use less of those products, right? So you can kind of have the carrot and the stick but at the same time. But we have to essentially suffer or accept that there's going to be changes in our lifestyle. Right? The whole goal in all this, if we say we want to change the outcome, we have to change the behavior. So if anyone tells you that we're going to fix this with no change in your behavior and you're not going to notice it can't work. It just can't, right? We have to have a change in our behavior. So anything that politicians can do that can change our behavior is going to be most effective. Obviously, we don't like that, right? No, we don't like for anyone to tell us what we can and we cannot do, and we don't like to be taxed and told, made more expensive to do the things we won't want to do. I don't know any other way around it. If we can all get together and come to some agreement and say we're just going to act for the greater good and we're not going to, drive, these big heavy cars and stuff, then better. That doesn't seem to be happening. So we need a heavy hand of the government to come in. Again, that's a dangerous thing to say because there's obviously, do we trust the government to be the one to do it? But we have to figure out some way to change our behavior. And I don't know the way to do it, so that we can think of penalties, rewards, but some way we have to change our behavior. And our behavior as individuals and our behavior as corporations and our behavior as governments, all of those things need to change. And they need to change soon.
So I know that, so I know you and your lab have worked and written a little bit about the effects of our diet on climate change and vice versa. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so our lab is, as part of this, as we think about the effects of climate change, we're often, the next step is, well, what can we do to fix it, right? These are the questions that come up. People want to know, what is the possible solution? As soon as we started thinking about these potential solutions, what we realized is it comes down to diet, right? And so we've been really pushing that a change in diet is one of the best ways that we can impact climate change, that we as individuals can impact climate change. And so we've been really trying to promote this for a couple of different reasons. One is that changing diet is effective, right? So if you kind of add up all the different things you do and the impact that they have on the environment, their ecological footprint of all your different activities, your diet is going to be one of the strongest, the most important things you do, right? It's not just the food you eat, it's all the energy and resources that go into producing that food and getting it into your hands, right? So there's a lot of energy there. There's a lot of climate change that goes into producing that food. The second reason we like to push on it is that people somehow aren't aware of it, right? So when other people talk about changes, they think about changing your driving habits, walking more, bicycling more, changing your light bulbs. But for some reason, people don't like to talk about diet. There's a whole kind of mindset that's opposed to the diet. They seem to think that it's sacred, that you don't want to change it. No one can tell me not to eat my steak, right? No one likes to be told what to eat and what not to eat. They'd much rather be told not to drive than what not to eat. So people don't like to hear it, and people have played up to that, and so they haven't spread that message very much. The other reason we like to promote it is that it can change very rapidly, right? A lot of times you don't have choice in whether you drive or don't drive, right? That's dictated by the infrastructure of the city, where you live and where you don't live. You can't walk into work if you live 10 miles from work if there is no public transportation. You're kind of constrained in your options in driving or not driving or some other choices of your lifestyle. Food is completely up to you, right? You can choose what you're going to eat each night, right? And obviously there's some limitations, but you can choose a healthier, diet. And I mean healthy for the environment, not healthy for the individual, but usually they go hand in hand. So we can make that change very, very rapidly. Overnight you can change your diet 100%, just by deciding to do it, right? There is no infrastructure buildup that's required for that. So it's effective and it's doable. And those are very important things. It is so effective because our diet is very inefficient, and we can make it a lot more efficient. As whenever we eat meat, and the higher we eat up on the trophic ladder, we require more and more resources. Eating meat, eating beef, eating all these things requires lots and lots of resources. So it's just very inefficient. It takes a lot of land, it takes a lot of resources to produce, animal protein. It takes much less resource, much less land to produce plant protein. And we can live perfectly happy off of that plant protein. Within that, there's even, we're not saying give up meat completely. There's types of meat that are better than others, and there's, allowance for a little bit of meat, right? You don't have to go full out on it, but we can do better than we're doing now.
Why do you think there is this kind of reluctance to change? Do you think there's a kind of a cultural effect on people's diets? Are they kind of deeply ingrained into different cultures, maybe?
I think there's something, there's something inherent in it of, try to take the food away from a dog, right? And they're going to resist that. There's kind of this innate, no one touches my food. So I think there's just kind of this innate primeval thing that you just don't want anyone touching your food. And we tend to build that into, we think that our foods are very, are written in stone, that there's this deep cultural history to our foods. And in many cases, it's false. I mean, so if we think of modern examples, shark fin soup was very popular in the Chinese diet up till recently. It became very popularized that this was bad for the environment, driving many species of shark extinct. they've been able to reduce their consumption of shark fin soup very rapidly, very dramatically, very successfully, right? So they took something that people initially resisted and said, no, this is a cultural thing, we're never going to change it, and they changed it, right? They just had to have the right advertising and peer pressure built into it. If we think longer term, a lot of the diets that we eat, we think are bound up in culture and deep history. They're not, right? We've had a huge mixing of ingredients around the world. So a lot of the diets that we associate with different cultures and ethnicities weren't there 100 years ago. You know, a lot of these foods didn't exist in the past. We think of the Thai diet, right? It's famous for having chili peppers and peanut sauces and stuff. They didn't have chili peppers and they didn't have peanut sauces. Chili peppers are native to the New Worlds, peanuts are native to the New Worlds. These things, they didn't have a few hundred years ago. Almost any food that you can think of does not belong in the country where they eat it now, right? These are modern inventions. Cuisine is a modern invention. And so it can be changed. It's not, you know, fixed. It's not deep history. We can change it, and we can change it very rapidly. But we don't want to hear it. I think, you know, the food industry is very powerful, and they've resisted it as well. So there's other pressures that have convinced us that these things are how we should eat, and is the only, you know, is the American way to eat. Beef, it's what for dinner, right? We've been told that for a long time. And, you know, it's hard to change that mindset.